Welcome, workers and friends. Welcome back to another installment of Working Class Revolt. I'm your host, Dust James, the Marxist-Leninist truck driver. I'm coming to you live from my my humble home in rural North Carolina. No place I'd rather be than sit here with my comrades studying socialism on this wonderful fall Saturday evening. Oh man, okay, that's on me. Boom, got that echo out of there. And I'm joined with me, as always, Thunder from Down Under, the prestigious and powerful working class revolutionary Australian union organizer, David Fox. How's it going down there, man?
Well, good morning, and it's actually a Sunday morning here. It's a nice day, nice spring day outside for us. I'm just here actually in the office here at the moment. The Trades Hall, Bendigo.
All right, and we have two great guests with us this evening, returning again to continue the study after it was his connection was interrupted. Christian, the socially radical guitarist. You can find his YouTube channel. Maybe I'll put some links for that later on. He is a public radio host as well. Thank you for joining us, brother. How are things over there in Canada?
Well, we got a token gesture of a holiday. I talked about that on the last episode. Another episode came up, and just recently had a good conversation with the Communist Party of Kenya deputy chairperson. So look forward to that video when I put it up later tonight. So things are going pretty good up here. Where we didn't do very well in the elections, but I think if we keep pushing that media, things are going to start to converge for us. So, yeah, things are going good in Canada when it comes to the struggle. Not necessarily the conditions, but the struggle. We're struggling.
Right on. Good to hear. The best times and the worst of times. So we're very glad to have a returning guest with us, CharChar, darling, Charlotte Forrester, published poet, English major, fellow member of the Center for Political Innovation. I believe you're in the New York area. How are things going up there?
Thank you, Jess, for having me again. Well, it is still hot and humid here in Long Island, New York. But that is to be expected, with the accelerated global climate change. And recently I've been we're continuing, my activities with the John Brown Volunteers. We have actually, along with the John Brown Volunteers, went to a beautiful ceremony 2 Sundays ago at Upper West Side. The foreign minister from Nicaragua gave a beautiful sermon. And we had a bit of a confrontation by the anti-Sandinista Gusanos, but we not only outnumbered them, but we've outshined them in every way.
Very powerful, very powerful. I understand that Caleb Maupin and Keaton Mansfield were able to deliver their new book, Jesus is a Socialist, directly to government officials of the Sandinista government, which was very positive, solidary work, and we're very glad to support our fellow anti-imperialists in the oppressed nations, and especially those leading the socialist movement. Tonight we're going to be. I don't have my copy with me, but if you want to hold up your copy there, we're going to be studying Stalin's foundation of. We're going to be continuing our study of Stalin's foundations of Leninism. We're going to do a brief read through of Chapter 1, the historical roots of Leninism, and then we're going to have a discussion on that material. So, without further ado. Maybe we'll do a round of introductory remarks on this chapter, folks are up to it. I think this chapter, it's very short. It's only a few pages, but I believe it is one of the most concise, precise. It says very clearly and efficiently what is the current era of imperialism. And it is one of the major sections that helped shape my worldview and turned me in from, a liberal or an eclectic into a scientific socialist. And I highly recommend this book, is specifically this section, to all the comrades. And this was the superstructure, or the political education manifested in the Great Soviet Revolution. The Soviet workers and peasants stood up and forged a new future, the first largest socialist revolution. And Stalin did these lectures and wrote this book, and it's absolutely wonderful and still a good resource. Maybe if anybody else has some introductory remarks before we read the piece.
Well, just on what you, just to further on what you said there, I think I understand how Stalin wrote it. It actually was a very dialectical method as well. Not only was it easy, but he actually just basically explained the relations between the external and the internal, what was going on in Russia or Soviet Union at the time, but externally around the world. It was important to actually relate that together, because, not putting anyone down, but when people talk about what was going on in the Soviet Union, they only just see one part of it, not the whole relations with everything. And I think that's vitally important, how in his writings, something to learn from there as well, to explain what was going on externally around the world, but also what's happening internally, and make those connections up, because nothing's separate, nothing's individual of each other. Everything's interconnected, and I think that's vitally important to always keep that in mind. There's the dialectical materialism, the dialectical relations. What he wrote in here, and this is what we're just trying to explain in that example.
Charlotte?
What needs and what makes us and what makes Stalin, stand out, even much more than Lenin and all the other great revolutionaries from the 20th century, was that he is able to take the writings of Marx and Lenin, and being able to make it accessible and more concise and condensed for the masses in Russia. And
right on. Anything to add, Christian, before we start our read?
Yeah. So if this is Stalin is the reason why CIA makes it a point to demonize Stalin. The reason why Western imperialist capitalist countries make it a point to demonize Stalin is precisely because of what Charlotte said before, and because if you read Foundations of Leninism, how he explains imperialism, and you understand it, you'll never get fooled by them again. When they come out and say, look what's happening over there, we have to intervene. Especially with this chapter, when they talk about the contradiction between the imperial powers and colonized countries and national uprisings. When people see Zimbabwe getting sanctioned, for example, both by the U.S. and by Canada, and you understand the conditions that ZANU-PF, when they rose up, they actually took back the land. Just like the Soviets took back the land, just like the Chinese took back the land. Then you'll understand, after reading this, those central contradictions. Imperial powers dominating the colonized countries. You'll understand why there are wars between major countries, why those wars actually happened. And you'll never get fooled. And if more people around the world were reading Stalin, particularly in the imperial countries, there would be a lot more mass movements against any kind of war, and be very unpopular to do. So Stalin is very important for that reason. It's because he's hated, and he's hated with good reason. So yeah,
Very
that's
powerful.
Yeah.
Very powerful, profound comments, comrade. Now we'll go ahead and get into the reading. I'll start, and then we'll go on to Christian, and then Charlotte, and then Fox. We'll do a paragraph at a time until we finish the work. Joseph Stalin, The Foundations of Leninism. 1. The Historic Roots of Leninism. Leninism grew up and took shape under the conditions of imperialism. When the contradictions of capitalism have reached an extreme point, when the proletarian revolution had become an immediate practical question, when the old period of preparation of the working class for revolution had arrived at and passed into a new period, that of the direct assault on capitalism. Christian?
Yeah, so Lenin called imperialism moribund capitalism. Why? Because imperialism carries the contradictions of capitalism to their last pounds, to the extreme limit, beyond which revolution begins. Of these contradictions, there are three which must be regarded as the most important.
The first contradiction is the contradiction between labor and capital. Imperialism is the omnipotence of the monopolist trusts and syndicates of the banks and the financial oligarchy in the industrial countries. In the fight against the omnipotence, the customary methods of the working class, trade unions and cooperatives, parliamentary parties, and a parliamentary struggle have proved to be totally inadequate. Either place yourself at the mercy of capital, eke out a wretched existence as of old and sink lower and lower, or adopt a new weapon. This is the alternative imperialism puts before the vast masses of the proletariat. Imperialism brings the working class to revolution.
The second contradiction is the contradiction among the various financial groups and imperialist powers in their struggle for sources of raw materials for foreign territory. Imperialism is the export of capital to the sources of raw materials, the frenzied struggle for monopolist possession of these sources, the struggle for a redivision of the already divided world, a struggle waged with particular fury by new financial groups and powers seeking a place in the sun against the old groups and powers which cling tightly to what they have grabbed. This frenzied struggle among the various groups of capitalists is notable in that it includes, as an inevitable element, imperialist wars for the annexation of foreign territories. This circumstance, in its turn, is notable in that it leads to the mutual weakening of the imperialists, to the weakening of the position of capitalism in general, to the acceleration of the advent of the proletarian revolution, and to the practical inevitability of this revolution. Dust.
The third contradiction is the contradiction between the handful of ruling, quote, civilized, unquote, nations and the hundreds of millions of the colonial and dependent peoples of the world. Imperialism is the most barefaced exploitation and the most inhumane oppression of hundreds of millions of people inhabiting vast colonies and dependent countries. The purpose of this exploitation and this oppression is to squeeze out super profits. But in exploiting these countries, imperialism is compelled to build these railways, factories, and mills, industrial and commercial centers, the appearance of a class of proletarians, the emergence of the native intelligentsia, the awakening of national consciousness, the growth of the liberation movement. Such are the inevitable results of this, quote, policy, unquote. The growth of the revolutionary movement in all colonies and dependent countries without exception clearly testifies to this fact. This circumstance is of importance for the proletariat inasmuch as it saps radically in the position of capitalism by converting the colonies and dependent countries from reserves of imperialism into reserves of the proletarian revolution.
Such, in general, are the principal contradictions of imperialism, which have converted the old, flourishing capitalism, so quote unquote, into moribund capitalism.
The significance of the imperialist war, which broke out 10 years ago, lies, among other things, in the fact that it gathered all these contradictions into a single knot and threw them onto the scales, thereby accelerating and facilitating the revolutionary battles of the proletariat.
In other words, imperialism has brought about it not only that revolution has become practical inevitability, but also that favourable conditions have been created for the direct onslaught upon the citadels of capitalism.
Such was the international situation which gave birth to Leninism.
Some may say, this is all very well, but what has it to do with Russia, which is not and could not be a classical land of imperialism? What has it to do with Lenin, worked primarily in Russia and for Russia? Why did Russia, of all countries, become the home of Leninism, the birthplace of the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution?
Because Russia was the focus of all these contradictions of imperialism.
Because Russia, more than any other country, was pregnant with revolution, and she alone was therefore in a position to solve these contradictions in a revolutionary way.
To begin with, Tsarist Russia was home of every kind of oppression, capitalist, colonial, and militarist, in its most inhumane and barbarous form. Who does not know that in Russia the omnipotence of capital was combined with the despotism of Tsarism, the aggressiveness of Russian nationalism with Tsarism's role of executor in regard to the non-Russian peoples, the exploitation of entire regions, Turkey, Persia, China, with the seizure of these regions by Tsarism, with wars of conquest. Lenin was right in saying that Tsarism was military feudal imperialism. Tsarism was the concentration of the worst features of imperialism rise to a high pitch.
To proceed, Tsarist Russia was a major reserve of Western imperialism, not only in the sense that it gave free entry to foreign capital, which controlled such basic branches of Russia's national economy as the fuel and metallurgical industries, but also in the sense that it could supply the Western imperialists with millions of soldiers. Remember the Russian army, 14 million strong, which shed its blood on the imperialist fronts to safeguard the staggering profits of the British and French capitalists.
Further, Tsarism was not only the watchdog of imperialism in the east of Europe, but in addition, it was the agent of Western imperialism for squeezing out of the population of hundreds of millions by ways of interest on loans obtained in Paris and London, Berlin and Brussels.
Finally, Tsarism was the most faithful ally of Western imperialism in the petition of Turkey, Persia, China, etc. Who does not know that the imperialist war was waged by Tsarism in alliance with the imperialists of the Entente, and that Russia was an essential element in that war?
That is why the interests of Tsarism and of Western imperialism were interwoven and ultimately became merged into a single skeith of imperialist interests.
Could Western imperialism resign itself to the loss of such powerful support in the East, and of such a rich reservoir of manpower and resources as old Tsarist bourgeois Russia was, without exerting all its strengths to wage a life and death struggle against the revolution in Russia, with the object of defending and preserving Tsarism? Of course not.
But from this it follows that whoever wanted to strike at Tsarism necessarily raised his hand against imperialism. Whoever rose against Tsarism had to rise against imperialism as well. For whoever was bent on overthrowing Tsarism had to overthrow imperialism too. If he really intended not merely to defeat Tsarism, but to make a clean swipe of it. Thus, the revolution against Tsarism verged on and had to press into a revolution against imperialism, into a proletarian revolution.
Meanwhile, in Russia, a tremendous popular revolution was rising, headed by the most revolutionary proletariat in the world, which possessed such an important ally as the revolutionary peasantry of Russia. Need it be argued that such a revolution could not stop halfway, that in the event of success, it was bound to advance further and raise the banner of revolt against imperialism.
This is why Russia was bound to become the focus of the contradictions of imperialism, not only in the sense that it was Russia that these contradictions were revealed most plainly, in view of their particularly repulsive and particularly intolerable character, and not only because Russia was a highly important prop of Western imperialism, connecting Western finance capital with the colonies in the East, but also because Russia was the only country in which there existed a real force capable of resolving the contradictions of imperialism in a revolutionary way.
From this, it follows, however, that the revolution in Russia could not but become a proletarian revolution, that from its very inception it could not but assume an international character, and that, therefore, it could not but shake the very foundations of world imperialism.
Under these circumstances, could the Russian communists confine their work within the narrow national bounds of the Russian Revolution? Of course not. On the contrary, the whole situation, both internal, the profound revolutionary crisis, and external, the war, impelled them to go beyond these bounds in their work, to transfer the struggle to the international arena, to expose the ulcers of imperialism, to prove that the collapse of capitalism was inevitable, to smash social chauvinism and social pacifism, and finally to overthrow capitalism in their own country and to forge a new fighting weapon for the proletariat, the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution. In order to facilitate the task of overthrowing capitalism for the proletarians of all countries, nor could the Russian communists act otherwise, for only this path offered the chance of producing certain changes in the international situation which could safeguard Russia against the restoration of the bourgeois order.
That is why Russia became the home of Leninism, why Lenin, the leader of the Russian communists, became its creator.
The same thing approximately, quote, happened, unquote, in the case of Russia and Lenin as in the case of Germany and Marx and Engels in the 40s of the last century. Germany at that time was pregnant with bourgeois revolution. Just like Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, Marx wrote at the time in the Communist Manifesto, quote, Christian?
The communists turned their attention chiefly to Germany, because that country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization, and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th and of France in the 18th century, and because the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution.
In other words, the center of the revolutionary movement was shifting to Germany.
There can hardly be any doubt that it was this very circumstance noted by Marx in the above quoted passage that served as the probable reason why it was precisely Germany that became the birthplace of scientific socialism, and why the leaders of the German proletariat, Marx and Engels, became its creators.
The same, only to a still greater degree, must be said of Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. Russia was then on the eve of a bourgeois revolution. She had to accomplish this revolution at a time when conditions in Europe were more advanced, and with a proletariat that was more developed than that of Germany in the 40s of the 19th, let alone Britain and France. Moreover, all the evidence went to show that this revolution was bound to serve as a ferment and as a prelude to the proletarian revolution. We cannot regard it as accidental that as early as 1902, when the Russian Revolution was still in an embryonic stage, Lenin wrote in his pamphlet, What is to be Done?
Quote, history has now confronted us, i.e., Russian Marxists, J Street, with an immediate task, which is the most revolutionary of all the immediate tasks that confront the proletariat of any country, unquote. And that, quote, the fulfillment of this task, the destruction of the most powerful bulwark, not only of European, but also, it may now be said, of Asiatic reaction, would make the Russian proletariat the vanguard of the international revolutionary proletariat, unquote.
In other words, the center of the revolutionary movement was bound to shift to Russia.
As we know, the course of the revolution in Russia has more than vindicated Lenin's prediction.
It is surprising, after all this, that a country which has accomplished such a revolution, possesses such a proletariat, should have been the birthplace of the revolutionary and tactics of the proletarian revolution.
It is surprising. Is it surprising that Lenin, the leader of Russia's proletariat, became also the creator of this theory and tactic, and the leader of the international proletariat? Well, we all know the answer to that. So, of course not.
Yeah, very, very powerful. It's almost, it's dense that it talks a lot about, it says a lot of things in a profound way, but it's remarkably easy to understand at the same time. Maybe we'll just do a round of first, observations to the piece and reactions before we get into details. I think probably the biggest section of most significance today would be the spelling out of the three contradictions themselves. The first contradiction, labor and capital. Second contradiction, the contradiction among the various financial groups and imperialists. The third contradiction, which is arguably the main contradiction today, with its further intensification, is the contradiction between the handful of ruling, quote, civilized, unquote, nations and the hundreds of millions of the colonial independent peoples of the world. So oppressor nations and oppressed nations, or colonizer nations and colonized nations, really began, the age, what was the age of imperialism. And those are the two contradictions today. The class contradiction and the national contradiction. And if you look at a lot of debates that are going on, it's the emphasis on either one of those, the focus on that. Which one should we focus on? How do those interrelate with each other? And I think it's very interesting that he says the contradiction among the imperialists themselves, because I noticed Caleb Maupin's always pointing out not only the contradictions among the imperialists themselves, like France or the United States or London, the EU today, but the contradictions among the capitalists within our own country, the Democrats, the Republicans, big oil versus
Silicon Valley.
Yeah, Silicon Valley, as well as mid-level capital. And I think some of the more dogmatic or narrow nationalist, somewhat obscure third worldist groups completely focus on the national question, and wrongly. I think some more principled third worldist groups will admit that there is still the contradiction of class, but we should focus on, the oppressed nations or national oppression. But it's interesting that not Lenin as well as Stalin notes that we should use all contradictions, regardless of the primary one. We should understand all contradictions, including, the imperialists fighting amongst themselves. The imperialists fighting amongst themselves, we could use to our advantage. So even if you are a third worldist, and you think primarily the major contradiction is of oppressed nations, you should be able to, if Stalin could use the fight amongst the imperialist powers, then you can use the fight amongst workers and the capitalists in the oppressor countries, or in the imperialist countries. I know I said a lot there. Maybe we just do a round of initial responses, or any responses to anything I brought up. I guess we'll start with Christian, if you want to go ahead.
So that's actually very good. Like that actually helps to highlight something, and it's called third worldism, but in another word, it's an excuse for opportunism. Where in Canada, for example, we have the NDP, and the NDP, they're the ones that came out and said we should sanction Israel, which is a good position. In the New Democratic Party, yeah. So the NDP comes out and says, "Oh, we should sanction Israel," and that's a good position. But then they go on to say we need to do something about the genocide in Xinjiang, and what they'll argue is, and actually, if you think about it, it's rooted in a third worldist position, where you have to look at the national question and look at the oppressed nations, and you think of China as another. That's actually an excuse that one NDP MP used to justify his position, is to say that China is also another imperialist power. But even if you were going by that position, wouldn't you observe the contradiction of imperialist infighting among the US and China? And why are you emphasizing China's imperialism against Africa? But actually, when you think about it, and you actually look at the math, about 98% of the investment is public investment into infrastructure. The other 2% is private. So if you actually compare the private investment that China puts into Africa and the private investment from all of the African countries combined into China, you realize that that's actually bigger, particularly South Africa. They give a lot of investment into China. So actually, Africa is the imperialist power when you compare the two countries. But that's actually one of those things where if you don't observe all of the contradictions and you focus on one thing and become dogmatic, it leaves the door open for opportunism like that. Of course, the NDP is not. They're not even going to call themselves Maoists anyways, but they used a third worldist argument to justify their opportunism. So that was that's one example.
See, yeah. Charlotte.
Am I muted?
No.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just to go back to it does remind me of the alliance between Australia and America in order to combat in order to gear up a war for China, and this is another instance of today's imperialist infighting, because France really did not like this move by the U.S., Australia, and was England in the other alliance? Okay, so it was UK, Australia, and the U.S. And and going back to Christian's point, like all the focus now is on China, because China is a global superpower, and it's and unlike the other imperialist superpowers, it is not an imperialist country. It is just a powerful nation, because they built up, because they have a different economic mode of production, unlike in the imperialist countries. But I am wondering, like Russia was an oppressed state, but it wasn't an oppressor state in itself, correct?
It was. Conditions were bad in Russia. it's interesting. If you look at the text, it says that all of the contradictions came to a head. So technically, they were an imperialist country. They were hooked to the imperialist bloc, but they still had feudalism there. So they didn't have the more advanced conditions, but they did have a virgin proletariat, and they were used as a military to help fight against Turkey and China. So it really was. What's the Marx and them said that, the revolutions were going to come from the first world. Oh, sorry, we lost Christian. Hopefully he comes back. The revolutions were supposed to come from the capitalist countries or the first world countries. But then Lenin was really the first one to say that no, the revolutions first came from Russia, and that was the turning point. And then the following revolutions came from the exploited third world because of imperialism.
What about Haiti? Like that was actually like the first anti-capitalist revolution.
Yes, that was,
and it was a very not only proletarian but a slave revolution.
Very powerful. Let's see what we're going on with first round of. Anybody want to respond to that question as well before we continue on with David?
Which question was this?
No, she asked us a question, and I answered it about was Russia an imperialist country, and I said affirmative.
Oh.
But Charlotte, do you have any other initial responses before we move on to David?
I don't know. It kind of like I don't want to like jump the gun or anything, but it is possible that the United States is going to that same position as Russia was 100 years ago, because we're seeing our own conditions deteriorate as the labor aristocracy is on its death's door, and if you actually go to like the subway stations, for instance, in New York City, you would almost be convinced that this is from a third world country, but no, this is actually from the wealthiest nation of the world.
Before we move on to David, I actually was going to bring this up later, and since Charlotte brought it up, and I'm the other comrade from the United States, I think she's onto something. The United States is the imperialist core, and surprisingly, the countries on the peripheral end up having better conditions than the imperialist core in this stage of decay. And I think it's because of there is a more powerful, monopoly capitalist here. So because they're more powerful, they have the ability to maintain their positions, but carry out horrific repressive programs like the McCarthy repression, the destruction of the union movement, as well as COINTELPRO, the assassination of the Panthers. They were able to do that in the core, and they've been doing it in Australia and Europe, but they haven't been able to carry it out to as much of an extent. And similar to Russia, the United States really is the military of the imperialist system. And it's largely United States workers and many from oppressed nation and oppressed regions like Appalachia or the South, and that have to deal with the brunt of fighting these wars. And people are tired of it. And the last two presidents who won, Obama and Trump, less so Biden. So two of the last three presidential candidates that won postured as anti-war. And there's a lot of anti-war sentiment. And as we see with Russia, peace, land, and bread slogan, this is an anti-imperialist, anti-war sentiment is a revolutionary sentiment in the age of imperialism. I know there was a lot said there. Maybe we can go on to Comrade Fox, any response to that, or also your preliminary responses to the piece.
Well, just before I go on, Kim Ford made a comment about hate speech against Australians. Kim, you're forgiven, all right? I don't know what you said, but you're forgiven, all right? We're not going to crucify you. Well, I was just thinking when we were talking before, because you mentioned that we touched on about AUKUS. It's come out for the last few weeks, and how obviously with the big submarine deal we had with France here to build their own, it was actually diesel-powered submarines. But in fact, what Prime Minister Scott Morrison and many others behind closed doors then completely ditched that contract, and then was switched. We want to have nuclear-powered submarines direct from the United States. Now, what's in that contract, I can't tell, but I will know this. I do know this. I mean, fact is, it's actually really now just completely ratified and tied our whole military to the US military. We basically have no control to it anymore. So everything, the communications, every little last nut and bolt and every other little bit piece you can think of, it's all now tied up in the whole in US industrial military complex. So basically, in a lot of ways, what in fact our governments have done, and previous ones as well, is gradually handed over our sovereignty to another nation. So all our policies are now dictated to by US foreign policy for whatever reason it is, and we're actually using now Australia as the launching pad for anything. If there has to be an attack on China, Australia will be it. It's actually a cause for concern for many of us here. Not fair. Not a lot of people have to wake up to the fact this is what's really going on, and it's going to take a lot of education amongst people. This is what's really truly happening here, and this is these contradictions are going to arise. Obviously, you've got the Australian population here who actually do want to form our own destiny and our own destination, and however, this comes into conflict with the imperial policies of what's been imposed on us through free trade agreements, through to other policies such as the military, prison, whatever. And you can see that those kind of contradictions becoming really sharp and antagonisms as well. And the conflict between labour and capital, that was always going to be there. But what we're seeing too in Australia, a lot of other contradictions out of all these lockdowns, the vaccine, and in response to what's happened with COVID. The fact is, you've got the small L liberal, or one section smaller capitalists. They're in struggle against the larger multinationals, such as big pharma, big oil, or the big mining and resource sector, construction, for example, all the big multinationals there. So you've got them on one side. Well, we also too see ourselves in conflict with the media. You've got the social media or Silicon Valley on one side versus Rupert Murdoch and his empire on the other. Now you can see all these contradictions playing out within Australia. But the main thing, what we're seeing here, it's actually the general population, the working people themselves, the First Nations people, etc., are the ones who suffer the most from out of this. So this is what we're seeing playing out here in Australia. So it's both what I've actually said to a few comrades, and I think we all agree, is we've got to see what's happening externally around the world and why it's even reflected internally here. And we're seeing this played out on such a worldwide scale now. China's supposed to be portrayed as the big boogeyman of the world. And even yesterday, a discussion with some people, basically saying, oh, well, China goes into these countries to do this. Well, actually, they don't just march in with the military and take over and everything else. They actually have meetings with countries. The One Belt, One Road initiative is a classic case to have a win-win economic development with all countries, where there's no actual sanctions applied, etc. And I think one thing about imperialism we see today, we've also got to look at the word dominance and direct force as being part of it. And what I don't see is China marching into Australia or anywhere else with an army and forcing that country to its own will. I don't see that at all. Unlike what's happened with the imperialisms of the past, but US, but with European, British, etc., they came in with direct military force and imposed their whole economic, social order on that particular country.
Very powerful. That's a good explanation of the. I'm not sure what was that. The second contradiction is can you guys hear me? The contradiction amongst the imperialists themselves, where France was mad that they didn't get to sell Australia, regular submarines, and the U.S. got to sell them. So and then there was another one with Iraq, where Saddam switched was going to switch to the euro to deal in oil, and next thing you know, they get invaded. Let's go over to Christian. We talked about the United States, a little bit about Australia. Maybe you can talk a little bit how some of this fits in with Canada.
Well, I mean, in many ways, for the proletariat, the U.S. Revolution was a fraud. And it's kind of night and day, quite clear. Like the U.S. acts as big muscle, particularly in Africa and in South America, as muscle for British banks, which British banks tied to the nobility, tied to the crown. So in many ways, that revolution for the working class, while they're fighting and dying in the Middle East for British banks, which is what happened with Iran when they overthrew Mossadegh. That was for the benefit of a British oil company. So it's that independence from the crown was a myth. And in Canada, the soldiers pledged their loyalty to the crown officially. So at least the hypocrisy isn't there. But in the United States, they pledged their oath to a constitution, which first draft was a direct insult to half of the army, because half of the army is racialized. So in many ways, the contradictions are all there, and they're all clear. They're all clear as day. The national oppression within the imperialist core, the imperialist infighting between the Anglo-Saxon alliance and the French, which are nominally within a larger alliance called NATO, which is really to buffer themselves against communism, originally against the Soviet Union and now China. But really, there's a lot of hidden infighting between the French and the English in Africa, South America, and other areas. So when you read the foundations of Leninism, you'll realize what the true contradictions are, and whether you're actually free or not, whether you actually have independence or not. And as far as the U.S. is concerned, especially when you see the far right vehemently defending the crown in the U.S., you'll realize that whole thing was actually a fraud, so far as the workers are not in power.
Powerful stuff. I think if Comrade Pella's watching, he did some great stuff. If you want to go back and watch our stream called "Down with the Crown," we go over some of those details.
I was just going to mention, Comrade Pella talking about England, and Christian, your talk, and as Christian points out, that Canada officially has allegiance to the crown, but but they've also kind of acted as like the HR or like the public the PR for NATO, and also, and then going back to England, Comrade Pella, he put out this documentary, which I'm still watching, is how a lot of I think all of our overseas banking has been transferred to London as a part of it. I've only watched like the beginning of the clip, but it talks about how England and London and Wall Street have a financial lines with each other, and that like the Revolutionary War against the crown, is been rendered meaningless as because we have the existing financial alliance.
Very powerful. I think I'd like to note that in the Civil War, the British bankers were backing the South against the United States at a time when Marx was supporting the Union Army and wrote for a Republican paper. I think I want to take this conversation and define imperialism. Go ahead. Before I go on to my next thought.
Just add on to that. just grab this little booklet. That's the Australian Constitution. And I'll just read something by that obviously for Australia. I just want to read this. As well as being a federation, Australia is a constitutional monarchy. Under this system of government, as the term suggests, the head of a state of a country is a monarch with whose functions are regulated by a constitution. Australia's head of state is Queen Elizabeth II. The concept of the Crown pervades the Constitution. For example, the Queen is part of Parliament and is empowered to appoint the Governor-General as a representative. The executive power of the Commonwealth is vested in the Queen and is exercisable by the Governor-General as a representative in 61. And I just wanted to point out the rights of residents in the states we actually regard as a subject. As the subject of the Queen, resident in any state shall not be subject to any state and disability or discrimination which would not be equally applicable to him if he were a subject of the Queen, resident in such other states. So I'm sure about Canada. I don't know, Christian might be able to lighten me a little bit, but that's what we're still known, and funny enough, as a subject, even though we like to call ourselves citizens. But there you go. It's there's a contradiction for you.
Very powerful note Christian raised. If anybody out there watching would like to ask a direct question to further discussion, it would be greatly appreciated. One of the things I wanted to raise this evening was kind of what is imperialism, the meaning of imperialism. And it's said clearly here. And I think both liberals have problems with this. Third worldists have problems with this. Everyone except principled scientific socialists don't really understand what imperialism is. And I'll just, read it again. I can't find the specific piece, but essentially, imperialism is the domination of the monopoly capitalism. Imperialism is a global political economic system. Emphasis on economic system. A global economic system that is dominated by monopoly capitalists, and particularly finance capitalists and some manufacturers. In today's day and age, oil and energy dominance is a key part of those monopoly capitalists. And these monopoly capitalists, you have, Amazon and Walmart, but I think the real big players are these oil banking cartels. And they go back to the 5 or 6 families. You got DuPont, Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie. Did I say Mellon? Though there's a few of those. And you can directly tie them, I think, with different oil companies. And you can directly tie them to the wars. British Petroleum, that Christian raised earlier, was there that kept the Shah in power, so the British could extract oil. And then Gaddafi was destroyed because he had petrosocialism. Saddam was destroyed because he had another form of petrosocialism. Venezuela has had sanctions and attempted coups and sabotage against them. Why? Because they're defying the power of the monopoly capitalists. That is imperialism. They control it. So a lot of third worldists, I think, get confused and then the liberals have a similar confusion where they think imperialism is only when a big country does business with a little country and takes advantage of that little country. No, that is the contradiction of oppressed nations. But that is not the entire system of imperialism. And imperialism includes the oppression of workers in the imperialist bloc. So to organize workers in the imperialist bloc and to gain victories, you are fighting against the common enemy of the monopoly capitalists. And when oppressed nations rise up and form socialism, they are fighting against the interests of monopoly capitalism. Both the workers in the first world and in the oppressed nations have an common enemy in the monopoly capitalist and in the imperialist system. That right there, what I just said, can clear up the majority of debates that are happening on left book and throughout, political discourse globally. What I just explained. I know I said a lot there. Maybe we can go around and respond to the question of what is imperialism. Well, I guess we'll start with Charlotte.
I guess the short answer for what imperialism is, it is a system where it drives down it makes sure that no developing nation develops into its full potential.
See, Comrade Fox.
Well, I see imperialism, it's also a system where it's designed to keep most of the world down, or basically, furthermore, what Charlotte just said there, basically keep all those countries poor and extract as much wealth out of them while the population remains poor, and that wealth becomes concentrated further and further into fewer and fewer hands, is what we're seeing today.
And it's also the complete rulership of the banking cartels.
I think an interesting note is here in the material we read today, it said imperialism forces the imperialist countries to industrialize the oppressed nations, which leads them, to form a proletariat and gives them more revolutionary potential. But I think Stalin was at the very beginning. Stalin and Lenin were at the beginning of imperialism. And now we're in imperialism as it's further decaying. And I think Parenti said some good stuff on this. And it's not that imperialism doesn't develop these countries and actually develop them further. It organizes their entire economy maybe around a specific good monoculture, like banana republics, around oil, around cotton, or something that they can extract for the imperialist system. So it doesn't actually develop these countries. It keeps them in a state of dependence and forms their entire industries around one thing or a group of things that can best benefit the imperialists. Let's go on to Christian. Anything to add on this?
Yeah, so to keep it in the simple terms so that people understand, China giving a 2% loan over 20 years for a bridge is not, for a public bridge, is not imperialism. An African country having that bridge and then getting over debt by the IMF and then having to sell that bridge to a private infrastructure company in the US is imperialism. So that's the difference. A war where the U.S. basically goes after a country for nationalizing a resource is imperialism. China trading a resource for an infrastructure project that's publicly owned by the government in question is not imperialism. So those are the two differences. The central question, just like the central question in what's happening here, what's happening in other countries, is ownership of the means of production, whether it's private ownership, whether it's public ownership. That's the central contradiction and the central distinction that you have to make in order to determine what imperialism is and what it isn't. So yeah, it's really that simple.
Yeah. If I could add, China's interesting. I think my definition of socialism in general is it doesn't have to be a completely nationalized economy similar to the Soviet Union, which also had some private. But China, the government has has supremacy. The government, the 90 million member Communist Party, with representatives in all localities, cities, and country, has superiority over the capitalists, over the markets that they have. So anytime the markets go and fuck up the Chinese people's interests, or hurting the people, or are hurting their neighbors' interests that they want to trade with and have good relations with, the government can step on and stop that from happening. So, I mean, China, without monopoly capitalism, there is no imperialism. There is no monopoly capitalists in China. China has nationalized banks, several of them to help them lift up their resources. So it's impossible. Even if they give loans to other countries, it's the government that their whole vision of giving those loans is building up their trade partners. It's not to make short-term profits for a few monopoly capitalists and oil banking cartels.
One thing
Be
I just
careful
want to
that
say.
you might be endorsing state capitalism there.
No,
I'm
not.
joking,
It's
of
overall.
course.
Go ahead, Christian, and then Charlotte and Fox. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so just going by what Charlotte said, state capitalism is a primary stage of socialism. Lenin himself endorsed state capitalism as a preliminary stage. So a lot of those ultra leftists aren't even reading Lenin when they say that. The first thing. The second thing is actually those loans that China is giving to other countries are the same loans they took from the Soviet Union. So if anybody can argue with a straight face that the Soviet Union loans that they gave to China were bad loans, looking at the history now, I would love to see it.
Charlotte?
Wasn't state capitalism actually the theory developed by a group of Trotskyists, you know, who are trying to denounce the Soviet Union as not being socialist but rather being state capitalist, even though the Soviet economy was not remotely capitalist, but just, you know, because the motor production was specifically for the benefit of public good and not any private actors.
Well, I mean, I could respond that I think what Christian said was right, but the Trotskyites manipulated that to attack the Soviet Union. Comrade Fox?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, obviously, capitalism is production geared to make profit. That's what it is. It's really everything that's created or produced. It's there to make, and our relations, it's all about profit. Where under socialism, no, it's for the benefit of the greater good for the public, etc. Now, when it mentioned state capitalists, well, when the Trotskyists go on about it, well, so no, well, the fact is it had to have a look at what was happening, even just after this war of intervention in Russia. I mean, the Soviet government had to actually put policies in place to actually have production. How can you say restore production? Obviously, to get the population fed, housed, started to move things forward very quickly. So they would have had to have some capitalists in there, and obviously, all right, we'll get this set up. Obviously, they'll make their profit in the meantime, but we need to get things moving very quickly. So I think it's something a bit of extreme. Yeah, okay, there's revolution, bang, doesn't all of a sudden straight away all the capitalist means of production disappear overnight just like that. It's like basically it's a struggle for political power first, and then we can start actually implementing things. What we need to be nationalised and gradually what could be corporatised. I didn't say corporatised. I said co-op or cooperised. I mean, etc. So all this and developing a centrally planned economy, how it would look like in our respective countries now. Well, that's up for the discussion, but. This whole total distortions of everything, this whole fanatical, pure type thing. This what it actually means. If anyone else differs, they're absolutely wrong about this. No, it's not. And actually, a lot of this writing was developed out of that time for the struggle when they started implementing the first 5-year plans, etc. Also, too, just on imperialism, there's also when people think, well, if any country exports capital, that means it would be imperialist. Well. The Marshall Islands exports capital. Are they an imperialist? Yeah, some small little country that exports capital doesn't make it imperialist. Imperialism doesn't mean just money gets thrown around the whole world. It doesn't mean that at all. It means it's all that wealth and that is concentrated into fewer and fewer and fewer hands, and while the rest of the planet suffers. And I think it's I'm hearing, when I hear these people, but Lenin said in 1916, and to the truth, if you actually break that line, then you are obviously distorting imperialism. Lenin started to change his view on imperialism back in, I think he wrote a second one about 1921. So basically that negates what he mentioned, what happened in 1916. We're not in a position where we have these big global imperial empires fighting each other like we're on the verge of World War One. This is a total different. We're in a different world now, and we'll go and understand. Well, this is where imperialism is at now. And you quite correctly pointed out, the US is the primary core super imperial power now. When you have France and many others around on there, but pretty much the US is the one that's the supreme one here.
Can I actually ask a question?
Go for it.
Once the U.S. loses its global dominance as the imperial core, who do you think would be next?
That's very hypothetical. It's hard to tell. Right now, we know imperialism is imperialism led by U.S. imperialism. Now, what's going to happen? How's it going to fall? Will the British take over as the core? Will Australia switch and be on the side of China? This is all speculation. We don't know. I have no thought on that. Y'all folks, either y'all.
Well,
go ahead.
I mean, all our systems, for either Australia, for example, I can't speak for Canada elsewhere, but like I understand our economy isn't tied up. It's tied up to the US one. Our dollar is, for example. Every other thing in this world is tied up in the US one. Where would, after, like, say, the US does decline? Obviously there'll be an internal struggle within the US as well to be a completely different country. So where would Australia be? I don't know. I can't answer that. But obviously we're going to understand it, and I believe the UK as well. Their economy is not separate from the US. It's all tied up to the whole big the US dollar banking system as well now. So just like ourselves.
I think there's one more issue I'd like to raise, and then I'd like to do a round of concluding remarks. And I wanted to bring up the issue of the national question. And I'm going to put David on the spot, see if he was paying attention during the reading. What is the primary purpose for national oppression?
The primary purpose of a national oppression, it's basically, primarily, it's obviously to extract all the wealth from that particular nation. And that's what I'm looking at it as. In a way I've interpreted, I'm completely wrong, but one nation doesn't oppress another nation for the hell of it, or just because they want to rule for no other reason. It's there, but primarily it's economic reason. They want to, and basically what imperialism does is push out all the other economies. There's to be no more rival. That's the plan of attack. It's like we're seeing this now on a national scale. Classic examples with the COVID stuff, right? You can see big pharmaceutical as dictating policy. We don't want you to have access to the Chinese, the Russian, the Cuban, or any of the other vaccines developed in other countries. No, we want you to stick with Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and I believe there's another one there as well.
Johnson.
Right, there, Johnson & Johnson, there you go. So you could see this playing out on a worldwide scale and playing out here in Australia. And this is where we're seeing, and what they want to do is actually making sure all the other countries are oppressed and squashed. So they have no choice but to buy from those big four pharmaceuticals. That's just one example. There's many others as well.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And the answer is to extract super profits. The purpose of class exploitation is to extract profits. The purpose of national oppression is to extract super profits. And that includes internal nations within the imperialist core. Chicanos and Aslan, people who the border crossed them, they didn't cross the border, who in their own land and their own country have been there thousands of years before the United States even existed are treated like second-class citizens through discrimination, through over-policing, through racism, and other things. But the primary purpose is super profits. And I think people lose sight of this. And I think this is the difference between nationalism on a material basis and cultural nationalism. And I think that's a lot of the fight that's going on. And you can see how cultural nationalism, which is, well, we simply want to be able to fly our flag and have our food and have our culture, but you can leave imperialism intact. You can still take out those super profits. And if you look at Parenti, this is what has happened with the independence movements. Oppressed nations outside the United States have their own flag. They have their own country. Their culture is attacked, through McDonald's and other things that the companies come in. It's largely they're allowed to have their own country, but those super profits are being exploited. Now you're talking about internal oppressed nations here, where there's a battle between cultural nationalists and material nationalists. And my good friends at Tele Jaguar and Ernesto of Partido Raza Unida are a great example of the more principled type of nationalists, which is inherently anti-imperialists, and that is those who fight against national oppression on a material basis. And if I could just give one example of how cultural nationalism is being twisted to maintain imperialism, I'd have to talk about the Land Back TM collective in Canada. If you look on Facebook, people got a lot of these land back profile pictures, and it says TM, and if you look into the research, it's this group called the NDN collective. Now, first of all, I want to say I'm for land back. I want oppressed people, indigenous groups, to build up power and take back resources and strike a blow against our common enemy, which is the imperialists. But what is the NDN collective doing? The NDN collective is pushing for privatization of federal land, and then developers are coming in, investing in this, and sharing it with Native people, and then extracting profits and then avoiding regulation. So they're using cultural nationalism, or a way in which nationalism is expressed without a material basis, and manipulating it to further exploit indigenous people and get rid of collective land that workers have fought for regulations on for a long time. Maybe I can get the comrade who's actually in Canada. Maybe I'm not sure how familiar you are with this issue. Christian, maybe you can talk on this a little bit.
Yeah. So you'll find that the situation is you'll find a lot of parallels actually between the land question in South Africa and even what's going on in Canada, where a lot of violence is acknowledged. There's supposed to be a land redistribution program, which is really just the government bribing certain individuals with cash or whatever, so that they can take that land as private property and extract from it. The sovereignty issue came to a height, particularly when the hereditary chiefs from Wet'suwet'en in British Columbia refused to relent, and it ended up with the CN rail being stopped by them getting in the way of the railways, and the root of the problem was that they didn't move the pipeline out of their lands. If the pipeline was publicly owned, they would just move it. But because it was privately owned, they didn't want to cut into their own profits. And going into imperialism and seeing a lot of that situation, you'll see the connections where with hyper-imperialism, what happens in many countries, like even East Asian countries, South American countries, African countries, is the goal is to destabilize and weaken a country to the point where private companies can take raw minerals and not even pay taxes. And they don't even pay the taxes to the government. I think Turkmenistan, for example, is owed about $460 million of taxes from a Canadian mining company. And mining companies, Canadian mining companies, they're 75% of all of the mining companies within Africa. So if you find like among indigenous movements that they're not for nationalization of resources and nationalization of the land, then one way or another, they're just perpetuating land theft. They're perpetuating land theft. They're perpetuating invasions on indigenous territory. They're perpetuating indigenous genocide. So those are the things that we have to understand, is that the land itself is not supposed to be private property in any way. Assuming that it can be a private property of any individual is already falling in line with the colonial mindset.
Interesting. Let's see, before we move on to Charlotte and David, I just want to add a little bit. This goes into a little bit about, identity politics, about how if we understand that imperialism is for the purpose of extracting, like it's material, we can look at it. There's a dollar sign on it. A society is set up to keep workers exploited so they can extract profits from them. Oppressed people, black and brown brothers and sisters, people in the oppressed world, are the entire political, economic, and cultural settings are set up to take out super profits from them. And the systems of racism have been there to maintain, this super exploitation, right? But so the problem isn't racism itself. Racism is a byproduct of capitalism, and racism is a way of maintaining. And this is where you get into the problem with race reductionism, where if it's only about race and it's white people oppressing black people, white people oppressing all other non-white people, you're completely losing sight of class oppression, national oppression, and it's liberalism because it's not national oppression on a material basis. And I think people get caught up with this because they're like, they start to learn, this country lied to me. This country is built on racism and slavery, and they're angry, and they're like, kill all white people or whatever, what have you, the third worldists and what have you. When they're not looking at what actually is happening, what's actually going on. Super exploitation and exploitation. And this gets into identity politics. Let's look at why is critical race theory being implemented by big military institutions. It's a very watered down form of it. I'll give credit the original critical academics. We're really getting at the material basis of national oppression. But this watered down version of critical race theory that's being adopted by the military and being adopted by the heights of Amazon, the heights of monopoly capitalists, it's a way of rebranding imperialism. It's a way of addressing racism without addressing the super profits extracted from the oppressed nations. I know I said a lot there. let's go back to Christian. Any response on that before we go into Charlotte or Fox?
Yeah. So to engage in either race reductionism or class reductionism is fundamentally it's anti-Marxist, and it's a violation of the principles of the first chapter of the Foundations of Leninism. Because if you think about it, it's race is a rule, racism is a rule and a method of rule for the capitalist system. It's a rule and a method of rule, but class is also the central contradiction of the capitalist system. So you can't ignore either. You have to look at both. So there are clear, defined definitions. For example, there was a Sakai guy. He put out that the white people are not proletarian in any way in the settler colony. Now, he wasn't using Marxist analysis to make that point, because it's your relation to the means of production. So the white people in the trailer parks that have nothing to sell but their labor are proletarian, whether Sakai believes it or not. It's based on an objective evaluation of their relationship to the means of production. So that's race reductionism, and ultimately what that ends up doing is justifying people saying, you know what, if we have a black person as president, everything will be fixed. And race reductionism is something that even Mitch McConnell, a far-right Republican, will highlight as a senator. When he was asked at one point whether reparations should be given out to the black population for unpaid wages, essentially, for building the country and not getting paid the wages, he replied by saying they got a black president.
That
was Mitch McConnell.
No, I actually didn't hear that. I actually didn't hear what he said. Can you repeat that?
He had said, no, I don't think we need to do that. A black president was elected.
Oh.
So he had said that. And here's something interesting. So-called social democrats in the United States will also have the same problem with race reductionism, class reductionism. When Bernie Sanders was asked whether black people should be paid for unpaid wages while building the United States, he had replied by saying it would be divisive. And those that ends up being the issue. Like, if you don't look at things from a dialectical way, from a Taylor's perspective, you're not going to understand the race issue or the class issue. And both of these things have to be analyzed in tandem, because it's a rule and a method of rule for capitalism, and class is the central contradiction of capitalism. You have to look at both. You can't pick one or the other.
Powerful. This is a very powerful discussion that needs, that needs to be said. Listen, maybe let's go on to Comrade Fox. Anything to add?
Well, it's interesting you put out. I mean, just going back over that part, is it the third contradiction? And actually, Stalin wrote this about the rise of the revolutionary movement. Basically, there's a mixed mash of everyone, be it the First Nations / Indigenous, be the proletariat, other groups as well, oppressed groups, mixed mash. And basically what we're seeing, the imperialists looking at that and think, what are we going to do to divide it? Let's come up with all these other theories and stuff. Let's put everyone against each other, and what way that we can stifle the revolutionary movement. And that's what I do see happening around the world. Australia is no exception to the rule. And when we're basically looking at all this, and it's just like, hang on, there's our common enemy over there. Why aren't we concentrating on our fight against that? Oh no, because we all start labeling each other, calling each other names and whatever else. We need to actually get back and say, oh no, this is the problem here. That what's primary, and people get. And I think what actually Christians showing there too is also too, but a lot of people out there concentrating on what's secondary and not what's primary. What's the root cause of the problem, and I think we've got to get back to that, and that's where we need to have a look. And I think when I'm saying it, it's also too, it's deliberately used, be that saying like, a white worker is different from someone who's coloured or who's indigenous and everything else. It's not. We're all got one thing. We've got the same relations to the means of production. If you want to look at that as the primary first contradiction, we don't own the means of production. We have to work. We have to sell our labour to live. And so in one form or the other. So what a great way to unite together to change the system. But they don't want to see it that way. I saw a classic cartoon. It was actually a picture of Rupert Murdoch, and I think he's got a pie or a big pile of biscuits or cookies, and you guys call them. And you got a worker, like a white worker, with one cookie or one part of it, and you got someone from overseas when they come into the country, and basically Murdoch saying he's trying to take your cookie. And basically that's their attitude. Well, he's ordered the whole lot, and and basically then trying to put that into this worker's head. So I mean, that shows you the sort of poison that's coming out of the whole imperialist system to try and keep us divided. Interesting. Sometimes I don't say too much. Sometimes on social media or wherever else, I just watch and observe at times what's going on. Some of the arguments. I thought, has everyone lost the plot here? Our enemy's over there. We need to, we need to focus and get back united again. And we, instead of coming up with all these other whiz-bang theories about things, and I think we need to get back to what the classics have stated, what Stalin wrote, what Lenin wrote, Marx and Engels, and also contemporary modern-day Marxists who are involved in struggle, and that's where it's got to happen. And I think, look, there's a lot more we have in common than what's there any difference. I mean, are there going to be different opinions moving forward? Of course, there always will be. I mean, the Chinese Party's got 90 million members. Not every one of them's going to see eye to eye on every conceivable issue you could think of out there. It's literally humanly impossible to do so. But if we can come up with some great things moving forward, I think that's what we need to do. And unfortunately, some of these series do come out. They actually come out of bourgeois intelligentsia, out of the universities, etc. I mean, it's actually not ingrained in everyday concrete reality for common working people, for working class people, indigenous people, our struggles. It's come out of some sort of thesis or that, someone standing far back, all right, we'll come up with this theory and make it a reality. It doesn't. In fact, it actually makes matters worse when they try to imply it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Comrade Charlotte, anything to add on this discussion?
You said that we have to simultaneously combat what was it, Christian?
So the race reductionism and class reductionism are both opportunist trends.
Right. Okay. So it just because that actually kind of remind me back to this paragraph about how the Russian communists must simultaneously smash social chauvinism and social pacifism, and that's something that we're seeing parallels today. So social chauvinism being, I guess you would say, would be like the libertarian right, and the social pacifism being the synthetic left. And it's and then, although I don't know how right wing libertarians could be considered class reductionist, but they are part, but I think I don't know. I think there's a certain chauvinism when it comes to class reductionist.
Very powerful. I think we'll do a round of. It's getting late. We're an hour and a half into this. I think we'll do a round of closing remarks. I think I'll start, and we'll go to Charlotte, David, and have Christian have the last word. I guess I'll start my concluding remarks by responding to Charlotte and talk a little bit about class reductionism. And I think a lot of people who watch this channel have a problem with it. They say that it's an invented thing and it doesn't actually exist. It does exist. If you do not recognize that oppressed nations are super exploited, are exploited more in more barbaric and humiliating ways, then you are not understanding the full picture of imperialism. And you can be manipulated to support imperialism. And it's that simple. And it's, you know, it's reactionary to try to say, oh, I'm just as oppressed. And I don't think it happens. I think the rad libs and the synthetic left and the left adventurists will call anybody, you know, that has a material basis, they'll call them class reductionists. But it is a problem, and it needs to be addressed. And I also want to talk about reparations. And I think we should support reparations. I mean, Afro-American people. This is going back to Harry Haywood, Malcolm X. I know the new term is New African, which is powerful, but I believe that whatever term is used should be determined by the oppressed people themselves. But I still say Afro-American because that's what Malcolm X and Harry Haywood use, and I'm from that school of thought. But all in all, I mean, $700 a week for hundreds of years that was stolen, not paid to people. It's absolutely disgusting. But I want to talk a little bit. Would it be possible for decaying imperialism to actually pay that back? Do they even have the wealth that exists anymore? And I would say the answer is no. They're spending their position is falling. All of their resources are used to maintain their position. They're constantly in need of these wars. They're constantly in need of doing all these very inefficient things. Capitalism is a subpar, inferior, wasteful, chaotic system. It actually is holding back the amount of productive forces. It's holding back material abundance. It's holding back history itself. So would capitalism even be able to produce everything it's stolen? And I would say no. And I think if we want a chance of giving back reparations, what's been stolen, we have to have a system change immediately. We have to have a socialist, anti-imperialist revolution, both it's coming and being led from the global south. But conditions will change here fast as it falls. We need to start building for a socialist revolution now, before the conditions get here. And we need a system change. We need it yesterday. Every day we do not overthrow the monopoly capitalists. There is several thousand children dying of starvation just in the time I've said these few sentences. It's absolutely disgusting. The humiliation and the poverty and the lives that are being destroyed by the imperialist system. It has to be done away with and destroyed. And in the amount of poverty here, you know, I grew up in poverty. It was 8 of us in a 2-bedroom trailer in a mile-long dirt road. And the schools in the South are horrible, partly because of the adjacency, all people's adjacency to the Black Belt South, the oppressed, the continued super profits extracted from the Afro-American people. It's absolutely disgusting. And if we want any hope for a better world, we need to build power. And we need to build power along all contradictions possible. Organize along the national question. Do solidarity work with the oppressed nations, you know, kicking off imperialism. Organize along class contradictions and lines here in the United States. Organize along national liberation lines also with the Imperial Corps. Get those to group with each other. Form coalitions. Build power to overthrow imperialism. I think that's our standpoint. We need to overthrow imperialism and build socialism. Step one. And then when we get forces, the productive forces moving. We have a more advanced system. We develop more abundance. Then we can just begin to start the healing. As Malcolm X said, it's not progress. If you stick a knife 9 inches into me and take it 2 inches out, you got to take the blade out and start the healing process. And I don't even think the healing process is possible without socialist revolution. Let's go on to Charlotte. Any final thoughts?
In addition to that, within the imperial core, we need a system change within the imperial core, a system that immediately addresses the needs of those from the very bottom of society. Because whatever is good for the bottom society, people who are having it the worst, the most oppressed within our own imperial core, it is going to be good for everyone else. So it must be a bottom-up organization, and we must address the needs of the people who are forgotten, and that is people within a disability community, visible and invisible disabilities, and the homeless. We need to start also, and I think the first step on a system change is organizing the unemployed and the homeless.
Great comments, Comrade Fox. Concluding remarks.
Yeah, well, look, it's been a good discussion tonight, and look, thanks for emphasising all that as well. And I think we actually do understand. Just obviously, you've seen the rallies that have been happening in Australia, and when they're saying, "Oh, wearing one of these is, against my civil rights and whatever," and I want to feel like they're oppressed, I'm thinking to myself, well, hang on, no, you haven't seen our own First Nations people, how they're actually treated by the system every day, from the day they're born to the day they pass away, how they live, especially in regional remote areas as well. Obviously, what they face is actually astronomically a lot more worse than some other people I do know. So that's obviously an important area of organisation and having unity with here for us in Australia. And I'll just go and say, if any of those you got comrades here, or if anyone else watching, I would highly recommend watch John Pilger's Utopia. If you'd understand where I'm coming from, it's about Australia and how Indigenous people are basically treated here. And I think, look, it's vitally important too to recognise there are levels of oppression. And look, I skipped that over just before my previous comments, and I do apologise. That wasn't an intentional thing. So I think we do need to recognise that, and there's certain groups that need that extra, they need some extra support as well. But that's the most important thing is through education. I mean, one thing for us here in Australia, we do have a proud tradition in the trade union movement here as well, leading a lot of struggles from and helping those groups as well, such as the Indigenous, such as supporting other peoples and other countries in the anti-imperialist struggle. We've got a fine tradition of supporting the Indonesians against Dutch rule. We've got a very rich tradition of the Vietnam moratorium for the Vietnamese people to have control of their own destiny against imperialist plunder. There, we've had that. Even supporting the East Timorese and now the West Papuans as well. We've actually still got a very rich history of that here in this country, and obviously it was through proper organisation and through proper education and agitation. Not in Pacific order, but that's and I think we need to carry that on as well. It's not just one group of workers benefiting from the other, and I think that's vitally important. We understand under imperialism that I'll just actually want to refer back to what Karl Marx actually originally says: "Co-workers of all countries unite," because and I think that's vitally important that we do that with repressed peoples around the world, that they are actually in the same struggle as we are, and we need to support that struggle, which is very, well, I'll say, extremely critical now, more so than ever more in human history.
Comrade Christian, go ahead. You can close us out with any final comments.
Yeah. So I'm about to say a very controversial thing that that causes friction even among some of the radicals and the comrades that I have discourse with in the U.S. Not so much in Canada. We generally have a consensus, but in the U.S. and in Australia and other nations, settler colony, the workers have no country. and the workers especially have no country in a settler colony, operating under the imperialist structure. If the workers want a country, and if the workers want a country that they can be proud of, without the stain of genocide on their heads and the stain of imperialist extraction of resources, then the workers have to break down the imperial apparatus that the settler colony is based on and build something that they can be proud of. And if that has to be done from scratch, then it has to be done from scratch. But that's justice. Justice is the primary goal of a revolutionary movement. The French Revolution was about justice. It was about getting bread for the work that they were toiling for the monarchy. The Russian Revolution was about getting peace, land, and bread for the work and the toiling and the dying that they did for the Tsar. The Chinese Revolution was about getting peace, land, and bread for the dying and the struggling that they engaged in on behalf of first an emperor and then a reactionary nationalist government, which in many ways, looking at the political system, is a lot like the U.S. A lot of colonial borrowing was going on. So as revolutionaries, we have to think about justice. What is justice? And if you're going to say that Israel has no right to exist, you're going to be having to look in the mirror if you're living in Canada, Australia, and the United States. So that is my final statement.
Powerful, comrades. So if everyone wants to raise their fists and repeat after me. Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare
Dare
to
to
struggle.
struggle.
Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
Dare to
Dare to
win.
win.
All power to the people.
All power to the people.
All power.
Thank you, everyone.